Let's have a look at the day's newspapers. Erin Agunke is joining us here on set. Erin, you're starting with that press coverage of the ongoing protests in Myanmar against the coup d'etat.
Yeah, that's right, Stuart. Tens of thousands of protesters took to the streets over the weekend in what's been described by the local paper, the Irrawaddy, as the largest protest in over a decade. So the paper says that the protests first gained speed in the country's business hub of Yangon before spreading to smaller cities across the city on Sunday. Now, the Daily quotes protesters who say that the military's claim that last December's general elections were stolen is a lame, absurd excuse. And this especially because the military chief who's now taking power has been eyeing the country's presidency for years, and it's been kind of an open secret. So they also fear, the protesters fear not only the military's assault on democracy, but also what they describe in this article as the coup's effect on the country's fragile economy, which of course is already gripped, like many, by the COVID-19 crisis. Moving on to French paper Libération, which actually emphasizes, I think is interesting, the economic interests behind the military coup d'etat. The paper therefore calls out foreign companies, and they quote French telecoms company Bouygues, as well as Total and the Verge, as complicit, saying all they have to do is, quote, lift a finger in support of those fighting for democracy in order to change the course of events.
You've also been looking at the coverage of Haiti, the government there describing a failed coup d'etat.
That's right. Well, I'll start with the Haitian paper, Le Nouveliste. The Haitian government claims it stopped both a coup d'etat, as you say, and an assassination attempt on the embattled President Jovenel Moise. The government arrested nearly 24 people, according to the Haitian paper Le Nouveliste, which concludes that these events kind of signify the end, officially, of Jovenel Moise's leadership. Now, why is that? The paper says it's because several judicial, religious, and civil society organizations, after the events yesterday, have finally voiced support for the opposition.
So why are people so dissatisfied, if you like, with their president then?
Many reasons, Stuart. The latest being that Jovenel Moise is what critics say clinging to power beyond his term limit. As the New York Times points out, the opposition says that his term ended on Sunday and is demanding he steps down, while he refuses, saying actually that an interim government had occupied the first year of his 5-year term. So there's some disagreement as to when his term really started and thus when his term officially ends. But that set off a constitutional crisis, and that comes up on top of two other major crises, Stuart. One, of course, is obviously the economic effects of the coronavirus pandemic, but the other, which the New York Times focuses on, is what they describe as a kidnapping for ransom epidemic, which has kind of spiraled over the past year. And it's gangs that essentially are kidnapping anybody demanding cash, no matter how poor. And that is something that has increased over the past year. Now, these compounded issues have put Haiti essentially on the verge of explosion. The American paper concluding that this political uncertainty has sowed feelings of dread. And of course, there's this fear that these demonstrations are going to plunge the country into long-term political unrest.
Let's change gear. We're going to talk now about the Israeli press reaction to the major ICC announcement over the weekend.
Yeah, that's right. So as a reminder, on Friday, the International Criminal Court extended its jurisdiction to lands that Israel has occupied since the 1967 war, namely the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Now, this decision, of course, opens the door for investigations into claims that war crimes were committed in these occupied territories, probes that could target both Israel and Hamas. Now, the Israeli paper Haaretz criticized Netanyahu's reaction to the decision, saying that his complaint that the ICC is persecuting Israel, according to Haaretz, tells us more about Israel than it does about the ICC. The paper says that Israel should view this decision as a red flag and notes that throwing mud at the ICC will not absolve Israel of its guilt if it did indeed commit war crimes.
And in fact, the investigations are also going to depend on whoever replaces the court's chief prosecutor. His mandate is almost over.
That's right, Stuart, and that's what the Jerusalem Post focused on. Current prosecutor Fatou Bensouda, who herself has suggested over the years that maybe Israel is guilty of war crimes. Well, she's leaving her position as chief prosecutor on June the 15th, so just in several months. As this article points out, it will be then her successor who will decide Israel's fate. The paper does, however, note that for now her successor hasn't been chosen. There's no really idea of who that could be. The paper simply concluding that obviously any candidate who seeks to prove that the ICC is willing to take on anybody, no matter how big, Israel, the United States, will be viewed as a problem for the Israeli government.
And finally from Erin, to finish up, the American press has weighed in on a new French COVID measure that goes against one of the country's most cherished traditions. I don't know what this is, but Erin tells me it intrigues her.
Yes,
You
it's
enjoyed
because
this, didn't
as
you?
an
What is it?
American,
Yeah.
Stuart, it's a never-ending debate. Now, the coronavirus epidemic has thrown off so many of our habits where we can't socialize the same way, can't work the same way. Here in France, the government, as you say, is about to touch something that is sacred, and that is the tradition of enjoying a meal at the table.
Right.
Now, the New York Times says, as viewers familiar with French culture might know, eating is a social experience, as the New York Times says, rather than a matter of mere nourishment. It is a pleasurable gathering to which much of life is dedicated, according to the Times. Well, the government has decided to allow French employees to eat lunch at their desks now instead of in spaces
Controversial.
dedicated.
Okay,
Yes.
I understand why you're enjoying this. Okay.
Yes, because I enjoy eating at my desk. I'm not going to lie. Now, until now, it has been illegal for companies here in France to allow workers to eat their meals in places dedicated to work, and they're reversing this now to kind of prevent the spread of COVID. The New York Times says that this rule reflected in the past the fierce French attachment to the country's art de vivre, which is incompatible with the quote heresy of eating a lamb cutlet with sautéed potatoes while gazing at a spreadsheet. This paper really calling out, or at least quoting French people who are calling out the continued kind of Americanization of French society.
I can't believe that this is the case. I mean, I've been here at France 24 for 10 years. How many people do you see sitting at their desks eating?
A decent amount.
All the
But there are a
time.
lot of foreigners.
That's true. That's very true. Erin, thanks a lot. Erin Agunke there.